welcome to this program on cost structures in distance education. I'm Santosh Panda, Professor and Director, Stride IGNOU. As you know that we have been discussing this for quite some time, and in the course ES 317 we have presented that cost, expenditure and funding, income and expenditure all are related terms which are extremely essential for making decisions, especially management decision making with regard to the income and expenditure of an institution. At the end of the day, the income and expenditure should come to the balance sheet, should come to zero. However, it is very important that the way we earn and the way we spend, we must also calculate how do we spend, on what we spend, and in what way we spend, and therefore to reduce the cost of education, and in our case, cost of distance education. Cost of distance education would depend on a variety of factors, but what we will focus today in this program is costing distance education, especially the cost structures. In another program, we will take up cost functions in distance education. I will take you to transparency by transparency through PowerPoint presentation and also explain the varieties of concepts associated with cost in distance education, varieties of costs, and therefore how to calculate those costs. And we will take up these when we discuss cost functions in distance education next time. I will take you to the first transparency to distinguish between cost and expenditure. As you would notice from the PowerPoint presentation, that the cost is basically calculated from the individual point of view and expenditure is calculated from provider's point of view, say in our case the government or the university. When an individual spends money, the amount of money that one spends to acquire that education and training from the individual student's point of view, it will be cost. But when the government would make that expenditure, that would be called as expenditure, because the government would make a budget and the government is spending from that budget, or the institution is spending from that budget on various educational and training activities. Also from the institution or the provider's point of view, it could also be considered cost, but that cost would be basically different when we talk about individual cost. Individual cost will be largely dominated by one's opportunity cost, that the earning that one foregoes to undergo that training, as also private cost which one incurs to acquire that education, other than the fees that one gives to the institution. So basically the cost and expenditure would be different, and the cost from the individual point of view and expenditure from institutional point of view. I will take you to the next transparency to say that what different kinds of costs are there in education and in what way they could be interpreted for distance education too. As you would see, that costs of education are basically institutional cost or social costs and the private cost or the individual cost. So from the institution's point of view, it is called social cost, because whenever an institution spends money or whenever a government spends money, it is considered as an expenditure for a variety of people in the society, and therefore it is for public good. But when an individual spends money for acquiring education and training, it is considered as an individual or a private cost. So institutional cost and private cost. As you would notice from left hand side, that the institutional cost or the social cost could be recurring and non-recurring costs. Recurring costs are those which the institution would be spending from time to time, all the time, as long as the activities continue. Non-recurring costs are basically costs with the expenditure for which is made for one time or maybe a couple of times, but it is not as recurring as all the time, depending on the amount of activities that the institution is basically intended to do. Say for instance teaching. The recurring cost, as you would see, would include the staff salary, the permanent staff, because every month we pay salary, the teaching and non-teaching staff. The stationery items, all the time we go on spending, payment made for postage, payment for rented buildings, because we go on paying rent every month, purchase of books and journals, or any miscellaneous item that we go on incurring all the time. But for non-recurring cost, you would see that these are all fixed: building, furniture, equipment, and such other items as could be called as constant or as could be called as fixed for the time being. So the cost from the institution's point of view is recurring and non-recurring. And from the individual's point of view, that the individual pays fees. So there are fees items and non-fees items. So fees items would be tuition fee, examination fee, computer fee, and all kinds of fees that a student pays to acquire that education and training and pays to the institution. The non-fees items would include books and stationery, transport, hostel cost, uniforms, and such other costs that the individual would incur other than the fees that one is paying to the institution. So these are the items one may or may not pay to the institution. If the institution is providing the service, then one is paying to the institution, and if it is not, one is paying to somebody else or some other vendors that provide these items. If we translate this into, say, costs in distance education, we have basically seen that there are institutional costs and private costs. If we translate this into the cost of distance education, you will find that there will be basically two kinds of costs. The institutional cost in distance education would be direct and indirect. Before institutional cost, I must say that in distance education too, there is an institutional cost. There is also a private cost, like the conventional education or the formal education system. The private cost in this case would be to come to the study center, to spend money for one's own purchase of stationery, to buy items, software, and so on and so forth. And the fees that one pays to the institution is also one's own private cost. But one item between both formal education and distance education, I would say, there is an item called opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is the cost that one foregoes, or the earning that one foregoes for continuing that education. If you are continuing education right now, and say for instance, and if you do not have a job, and if you have got a job and the kind of earning that you would make before coming to this education, that earning would be, or a monthly salary would be considered as an opportunity cost which you are sacrificing to continue your education. If you are in job and still continuing your education, as mostly the case in distance education, then certainly the opportunity cost comes to almost nil, provided there is a best alternative available and the alternative earns more money, and the opportunity cost will be higher. But otherwise, in that case, if you are in a job and you are also continuing your studies, your opportunity cost will be nil. As you see in the institutional cost in distance education, there are direct costs and there are indirect costs. Direct costs are directly related to the operation of the activity. So for instance, mainly I have written down to development of multiple media learning resources and presentation and implementation through a network of study centers. So when we are spending money directly on development of self-learning materials, organizing meetings, paying to course writers, paying to editors, paying to graphic artists, media producers, and so on and so forth, we are directly incurring that on course material development. And when we are spending money on starting from dispatch of materials to conduct of examinations, we are also spending money, and this direct cost will be proportionate to the students admitted to a particular program. So therefore we are directly spending on student for development of materials, or per student for development of materials and for presentation or implementation of materials, or as we call instructional delivery. For indirect cost, you would see that basically these are called overheads, because these are not directly responsible per student. Irrespective of the number of students, we go on spending. Say for instance, I've noted down, we spend money for administration, the entire administrative machinery that we have, the finance, the state management, campus development, development of study centers, deployment of media resources, irrespective of number of students, and for which we go on paying either recurring salary to the people or non-recurring for fixed for quite some time. We construct a building and continue for 5 or 10 years, we then renovate. So you would see in distance education, basically the cost types would be direct costs, which are related to the expenditure on development of learning resources and implementation of the program through a network of study centers. And the indirect cost would be basically overheads. based on this, I will take you to the other transparency which extends this relating to costs in distance education. You would find here that the cost types would be operating and capital costs, fixed and variable costs, recurring costs, and non-recurring costs. Let me explain a little more. So operating, as I have noted down here, the revenue cost. Operating costs and capital costs. Operating costs are those costs, those items of expenditure by the institution which the institution spends to conduct the particular program. So operating costs are basically relating to all the recurring expenses. And operating costs are directly proportionate to or directly related to the number of students admitted and the operation of activities, varieties of activities that the institution undertakes. So other than the capital cost would be fixed in a way, saying that we invest on building, we invest on media networks, for which for quite some time, for a number of years, those costs would remain constant because we spend for one time to come, and maybe we renovate or we change that after some time. So operating, revenue expenditure, and capital expenditure. The other cost items that we'd be using in distance education is fixed and variable cost. As we have been using in education, so also in distance education, fixed and variable costs. There is an item also semi-variable costs. So fixed and variable costs. The fixed costs in formal education, for instance, would be establishment of a laboratory, construction of buildings, and so on and so forth. In distance education, that cost would be extended to quite a few items which we cannot really think of in conventional or formal system of education. Say, for instance, expenditure on developing learning material resources, learning materials, or as we call self-learning materials. So fixed costs are the cost which will be related or which will be directly related to the institutional activities, irrespective of the number of students admitted. We say, for instance, we do not know how many students will be admitted. We are launching a program, and therefore we go on spending money in organizing meetings, designing curriculum, developing materials, writing, editing, graphics, audio, video, and so on and so forth. We develop the multiple media learning packages, and we already spend that money before the students are admitted. So therefore, all the expenditure that we incur on all these items before that the students are admitted, they would be called as fixed costs. The variable cost would be that those items of expenditure, the cost that would vary depending on the number of students. Say, for instance, the number of copies to be printed. So in the previous case, in fixed cost, we will calculate up to, say, for print materials, up to a camera-ready copy. So once the camera-ready copy goes to press, and we go on printing, say, 10,000 copies because there are 10,000 students. So these costs would be variable costs because our expenditure will depend on the number of students. If there are 20,000 students, then we go on printing 20,000, and therefore our cost would increase that much. So therefore, fixed costs are fixed irrespective of any number of students that are admitted, and variable costs are those which are incurred depending on the number of students. The semi-variable cost would depend on certain activities that are undertaken mid-term or from time to time on a continuous basis, depending on the number of students available. So, for instance, if we spend on counseling, for instance, that if the students are coming for a certain period of time for counseling, and we pay tutors depending on the counseling sessions, these will be semi-variable costs. They will be varying depending on how many students are coming and how many sessions are being conducted. But fixed costs are fixed, and variable costs are depending on exactly the number of students. But the semi-variable cost will be depending on the different kinds of activities that we'll be undertaking, depending on how many students are coming to a particular activity. If we go back to the transparency, you'll find that there are two other items that we have written in cost terms: recurring costs and non-recurring costs. You will see in the transparency that the recurring costs are those costs which we will be incurring from time to time, depending on the activities or the size of activities that we undertake. And recurring expenditure are those kind of expenditure which we go on spending irrespective of the students admitted. And recurring expenses are those which an institution makes for all time to come, every month, every time. And non-recurring costs are those which will be again depending on the types of activities that are undertaken from time to time, which are not necessarily year-long activities or activities marked for the whole year. So for instance, we have to pay salary to the teaching and non-teaching staff, and we go on paying every month, and therefore this item is a recurring expenditure. And when, say for instance, that we employ, say, consultants for 6 months or 1 year, we know that for the 6 months or 1 year the consultants will be there, and therefore that expense will be depending on the kind of activity that we are undertaking midterm for a certain period of time, not recurring all the time. So recurring expenditure and non-recurring expenditure. Now you will see in this transparency that we have brought in the other set of cost variables in distance education. So you see in this transparency that we have brought in the fixed cost and the variable costs. So fixed direct cost and fixed indirect cost, and variable direct cost and variable indirect costs. We have introduced here two items now, fixed cost and variable costs. The fixed costs are those costs which are fixed for all time to come without depending on the volume of activities that we undertake. Say for instance, we have already said that we spend money before undertaking that program. While talking about fixed and variable cost, we have also said in the previous transparency, while also talking about operating and capital costs, fixed and variable cost, and recurring and non-recurring cost, we said that the fixed costs are the kinds of expenditure that we incur irrespective of the number of students admitted to a program, which will be in future. And variable costs are those which will be exactly depending on the number of students. And variable costs could also be, some of the items could be semi-variable costs. Now the fixed cost could be direct, fixed cost could be indirect. Indirect, we have already said, it is overhead. So for instance, one example of fixed direct cost is paying to the writers and editors of self-learning materials. And say for instance, fixed indirect cost would be that say for instance, we have to pay salary to program coordinators, who are basically the faculty members. So the faculty members' salary is certainly fixed, but it is an overhead, but it is not depending on the total credits of materials or self-learning units that we are developing. Development of self-learning units will be depending on how much we are paying to course writers, to editors, graphic artists, and so on and so forth, till we make camera-ready copy. But in the meantime, we have also faculty members who say, for instance, I'm developing a program, I'm a program coordinator, and my salary has to be accounted for in calculating the costs for that particular program, and therefore my cost would be considered as a fixed indirect cost. When we go to variable costs, variable cost would be depending on, it could be direct, it could be indirect. So variable direct cost and variable indirect cost. The variable direct cost would be that directly depending on the number of students admitted. Say for instance, how many assignments we are checking every semester or every month or every year, for instance, depending on the number of students. So when we pay for checking of assignments, this is certainly per student, and it is a variable but direct cost. The variable indirect cost would be, say for instance, that we have set up a student call center, a student information center, that any student who would be talking to that center will be provided all kinds of information, whether through mobile SMS services or by telephone, and so on and so forth. So we do not know how many students. The students for a particular program could also call, and students from other programs could also call, and somebody from outside the program, outside the university, those who are not necessarily students of the public, could also call to know about the university and its activities and the programs to get a future admission. So therefore, the variable direct cost will be depending on the nature of activity that we undertake per student, depending on the number of students. Like for instance, we pay for assignment per student, and variable indirect cost would be that the overhead, but which is variable, which will be depending on the number of people who would be calling to a call center of the university, for instance. Now let me take another aspect of cost, as you see on the transparency, the average and marginal cost. These two cost calculations are very important besides fixed and variable costs that we often use in distance education: fixed and variable costs, and average and marginal costs. You would notice that average is the mean, total divided by the number. So for instance, so if we have spent 1,000 rupees on 10 students, 1,000 divided by 10 students, so rupees 100 would be the average cost per student. So average cost would be the average or the mean of the total expenditure divided by the number of students admitted for that particular program. So average cost would be cost per student. When we talk about average cost, that how much money we are spending for costing per student. Say I gave an example of 1,000 divided by 10 students, so 100 rupees per student. So as you would see, the total cost divided by the number of students. Very simple calculation. It's not that simple when we get into the complexities of cost calculation. The average cost is the total cost divided by the number of students. When we come to marginal cost is the expenditure that we incur while admitting one more additional student. Say for instance, for 10 students, we have been spending 1,000 rupees. For admitting the 11th student, how much additional money we spend? We may not spend 100 rupees, we may spend 90 rupees additionally, or we may spend 110 rupees. It can't be 100 rupees. If it is, we will discuss a little later. If it is, then we were certainly achieving the economy of scale. So marginal cost is the cost or the expenditure that we incur while admitting an additional student. So average cost is the cost per student who is already admitted, and the marginal cost is the cost or the expenditure that we would incur when we would undertake an exercise to admit, or we decide that we will be admitting a few more students. So for each additional student, the cost that we go on incurring, certainly the cost will increase, we go on incurring, is what is called the marginal cost. I will take you to the final analysis in cost calculations. As you would see in the transparency, that finally we talked about fixed and variable cost, average and marginal costs, and now finally unit cost. Unit cost is the cost per student or per unit. The unit is the student. The unit could be a credit self-learning material, an audio program, a video program, but generally the unit refers to the student, and therefore unit cost is the expenditure or the cost incurred per student. That per student could be a student who is already admitted, who is continuing education. That per student could be a graduate who has already graduated from the university, and therefore these two costs would differ. Some would argue that some would like to calculate cost per student, that the students who have been admitted and who are continuing their education, so how much money we are spending per student for a particular program. And the cost per graduate would be that when the students complete their education, get their degree, and go out of the university with their degree, and how much money we have spent per the student. And these two calculations would have different intentions and for different kinds of decision making. So unit cost would depend on average and marginal cost, or it could be cost per student or cost per graduate. So we have seen the average and marginal costs earlier. Now let us get into the next transparency, which talks about the behavior of average and marginal costs. You would see from this transparency that the x-axis talks about the number of students enrolled. The y-axis talks about the cost per student. It could be total cost, but here we are talking about cost per student because we are talking about average cost and marginal cost. Now these dotted lines are indicated. Marginal cost is indicated by these dotted lines, and the straight line indicates the average cost. Now when we start admitting students, we go on increasing the enrollment, and certainly our average cost will go on falling, because the larger the number of students, the per student expenditure will certainly come down. This is the basic cardinal principle over here. But there is a point here after which every increase in student enrollment will increase the average cost, that is cost per student. So if the cost from 100 rupees is coming down to 50 rupees here, and after this point an additional enrollment will go on increasing the cost from 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, and it will go on increasing again to 100 rupees, and it will be more. So the starting point was, say for instance, 100 rupees per student, and we achieved 50 rupees per student at this point, and again after that, with increase in number of students, it goes on increasing, and a time will come that the cost will cross, or this will surpass the initial cost that we were incurring, say for instance 100 rupees. It will go beyond 100, it may be 110, 120, 130 and 140. The cost will go on increasing. Therefore it is said that at this point that we must stop further increasing the enrollment, or we should do something else. Otherwise our cost per student is increasing beyond what we had been incurring at the starting of the program. So with increase in enrollment, the average cost will, or cost per student will come down, and after this point the cost will further increase, cost per student. Now when we go to marginal cost, that up to this point, when we go on increasing the number of students, the marginal cost also will go on increasing. But at certain point of time, at this point, say for instance the point called n, for instance, at this point, after this point, the marginal cost is certainly lower than the average cost, but the marginal cost also increasing. So when we go on increasing the number of students, the per student cost will come down and it will again increase. At this point also the marginal cost is also falling down, and at this point the marginal cost has again started increasing. So marginal cost is the cost incurred to admit an additional student. 1001, 1002, 1003 and so on and so forth. So therefore at this point n, for instance, a point A, as you would see that when the marginal cost is still falling, and after that marginal cost has started increasing. At this point A, we would call that we are achieving what is called economy of scale. At this point economy of scale has started here, and we can continue achieving economy of scale in the sense that we are not incurring any loss. So we start achieving economy of scale from here, and up to this point we go on achieving economy of scale, and after that there is little anxiety that both the costs, both marginal as well as average cost, are increasing, and at the point of B where the marginal cost and the average cost are going on increasing, we should stop admitting student. This is a caution here that we might achieve diseconomies of scale, that we might go on incurring loss from this point, and after this point where we had started, beyond that it is certainly loss. We are sure that there will be loss. So therefore the average cost and marginal cost behavior you could see from this diagram. Now let me take you to other cost concepts, and this is my final transparency for you: cost effectiveness and cost efficiency. So when we have discussed about cost, now let us talk about cost effectiveness and cost efficiency. Cost effectiveness simply means that given the expenditure, given the budget, given the cost, we have been able to achieve the objectives that we had already set. So we have spent the money and we have achieved the objectives. We are cost effective. But cost efficiency could be that is there any other alternative way to spend that money to achieve the same goal, that we spend less but achieve the same goal, or we spend more to achieve more, for instance, or is there any alternative way that we could reduce the cost per student? We could achieve the same quality output, but we can reduce cost per student. We can reconsider our student support strategy. We can reconsider our material development strategy, material dispatch strategy, media strategy, and so on, and so assessment, continuous and term and examination strategy, and so on and so forth. So therefore cost effectiveness and cost efficiency would tell us that we must always aim at cost effectiveness, and if we can achieve cost efficiency, this is certainly a bonus. And therefore economy of scale will depend on to what extent we have been able to achieve cost effectiveness fully say for instance, and we are going towards achieving cost efficiency, we are still achieving economy of scale. By the time we do not achieve cost efficiency and we are threatened that cost effectiveness is also disturbed, then we are not achieving economies of scale. Friends, thank you very much for your patience listening to this program. We have discussed in this program varieties of cost concepts, both in education and distance education. We talked about direct and indirect cost, institutional and private cost or individual cost. We talked about average and marginal cost, fixed and variable costs, and finally we talked about unit cost, the idea that cost per student enrolled or cost per graduate who has taken the degree. And finally, we talked about cost efficiency and cost effectiveness, and all the institutions and we particularly must aim at achieving economy of scale, that we both achieve cost effectiveness and cost efficiency.